The 1904 St. Louis Marathon. Imagine a sporting event so disastrous, so comically tragic, and so scientifically illiterate that it resembles a script rejected by Hollywood for being too unrealistic. Imagine a race where the runners are chased off course by wild dogs, where the initial winner hitched a ride in a car, and where the actual gold medalists crossed the finish line fueled not by water or Gatorade, but by a lethal cocktail of raw eggs, brandy, and rat poison. This was not a dystopian game show. This was the Olympic Marathon of 1904, held in St. Louis, Missouri. It remains, to this day, the strangest athletic competition ever held on American soil. Part 1. The Stage of Hubris. To understand the madness of August 30th, 1904, one must understand the setting. The United States was stepping onto the global stage, brimming with industrial confidence. St. Louis was hosting the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, the World's Fair, a sprawling celebration of human achievement. The Olympics were merely a sideshow attached to the fair, treated as an afterthought to the displays of new technology and cultural exhibits. The mastermind behind the games was James Sullivan, the chief organizer. Sullivan was a man who believed in scientific testing, but his science was medieval. He wanted to use the marathon to test the limits of human endurance under extreme conditions. He purposefully designed a course that was not just difficult, but sadistic. The route was 24.85 miles long. Marathons weren't standardized to 26.2 miles yet. It wound through the dusty, unpaved roads of St. Louis County. It featured 7 distinct hills, some with brutal inclines. But the terrain wasn't the killer. The environment was. On the day of the race, the temperature soared to over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity thick enough to chew on. Despite this scorching heat, Sullivan made a decision that borders on criminal by modern standards. He minimized water availability. There was only one water station on the entire course, a dirty well located at the 11-mile mark. Sullivan wanted to observe purposeful dehydration to see if humans performed better when denied liquids. Part 2. The Motley Crew. 32 athletes lined up at the start. It was a bizarre mix of professionals and random strangers who happened to be in town. There was Sammy Mellor, an American champion and the favorite to win. There was Thomas Hicks, a British-born American brass worker who was running for glory, though he was already exhausted from the heat before the gun went off. There was Fred Lors, a bricklayer who did his training at night after work, known for his speed but not his stamina. Then there were the characters who made the race a circus. Felix Carvajal, a Cuban mailman who had raised money to come to the Olympics by running across the length of Cuba. Upon arriving in New Orleans, he lost all his money in a craps game. He had to hitchhike and walk to St. Louis. He arrived at the starting line minutes before the race, wearing street shoes, a long-sleeved white shirt, and heavy wool trousers. A fellow athlete, taking pity on him, found a pair of scissors and cut Carvajal's trousers into jagged shorts so he wouldn't die of heat stroke. Then there were Len Tanyane and Jan Masciani. They were Tswana tribesmen from South Africa who were actually in St. Louis as part of a Boer War reenactment exhibit at the World's Fair. They had never run a marathon. They ran barefoot. They were the first black Africans to compete in the modern Olympics. At 3:03 p.m. in the blistering mid-afternoon sun, the gun fired. Part 3. Into the dust. Chaos ensued immediately. The roads were not closed to traffic. As the runners took off, they were flanked by a cavalcade of automobiles, horse-drawn carriages, and delivery wagons carrying officials, doctors, and reporters. The cars of 1904 had no emission standards and kicked up massive clouds of dust. Because it hadn't rained in weeks, the dust turned into a choking smog. The runners weren't just battling heat, they were inhaling thick dirt. Within miles, men were coughing up mud. William Garcia of California nearly became the first casualty. The dust coated his esophagus and ripped apart his stomach lining. He collapsed on the side of the road, hemorrhaging internally. If he hadn't been found by a passing doctor an hour later, he would have died. Part 4. The Comedy of Errors. As the race progressed, The athletes began to fall apart in spectacular fashion. The Cuban mailman, Felix Carvajal, despite his lack of training and attire, was actually running a fantastic race. He was chatting with spectators in broken English. However, he hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. Passing an orchard, he saw some apples and stopped to eat them. Unfortunately, the apples were rotten. Carvajal developed severe stomach cramps. He simply lay down on the side of the road and took a nap. He slept for a while, woke up feeling better, and started running again. Meanwhile, the South African runner, Len Tanyane, was running a strong race until he encountered a uniquely American problem: wild dogs. A pack of feral dogs chased Len Tanyane nearly a mile off the designated course. He had to outrun them to survive, then circle back to the track. Despite this terrified detour, he still managed to finish 9th. Part 5. The Cheater. At mile 9, Fred Lors, the bricklayer, succumbed to cramps. He was done. He waved down one of the accompanying automobiles and hopped in. He sat comfortably in the passenger seat, waving at the miserable runners he passed, enjoying the breeze. He rode in the car for 11 miles. Near the finish line, the car broke down. Lors, feeling refreshed and mischievous, decided to jog the rest of the way. He entered the Olympic Stadium to a roar of applause. He broke the finish line tape. Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, was there to place the gold wreath on his head. Just as the ceremony was about to start, someone in the crowd yelled, "He was in a car!" Lors laughed, claiming he was just joking and never intended to accept the medal. The officials were unamused and banned him for life, a ban that was lifted a year later.
Part 6. The Poisoned Victor. While Lors was playing his prank, the real drama was unfolding with Thomas Hicks. Hicks was dying. By mile 10, he was severely dehydrated. By mile 15, he was hallucinating. He begged his support team for water. They refused. Instead, his trainers, adhering to the insane sports science of the time, decided to stimulate him. They sponged his mouth with warm distilled water and then fed him a mixture of egg whites and strychnine. Strychnine is rat poison. In small doses, it acts as a stimulant for the nervous system. In large doses, it causes seizures and death. Hicks took the poison and kept moving, his legs mechanically shuffling forward. Miles later, he collapsed again. His trainers gave him more strychnine, this time washing it down with a swig of brandy. By mile 20, Hicks was a zombie. His face was ashen, his eyes were rolling back in his head, and he was hallucinating that the finish line was still 20 miles away. He was no longer running, he was shuffling. As he entered the stadium, the crowd was confused. Lors had already finished, but when the truth about the car came out, the focus shifted to the gray-faced man stumbling onto the track. Hicks could not lift his legs. His trainers literally carried him, holding him up by his shoulders, while his feet dragged across the dirt. He was technically running in the air. They dragged him across the finish line. Thomas Hicks was declared the winner. Part 7. The Aftermath. Hicks collapsed immediately. Doctors rushed to him. If he had taken one more dose of strychnine, he would have died on the spot. He had lost 8 pounds during the race. He never ran professionally again. The result of the race was a catastrophe. First place, Thomas Hicks, drugged and carried. Second place, Albert Corey, a Frenchman who arrived without papers, so he was listed as running for the Chicago Athletic Association. Third place, Arthur Newton. Fourth place, the Cuban mailman Felix Carvajal, who would have likely won if he hadn't stopped for a nap. Only 14 of the 32 starters finished the race. The 1904 St. Louis Marathon was such a disaster that the Olympic Committee seriously considered abolishing the marathon from the Olympics forever. It was viewed as man-killing and medically irresponsible. Conclusion. The 1904 St. Louis Marathon stands as a monument to human grit, but also to human stupidity. It was a race run in a cloud of dust, fueled by poison, interrupted by naps and wild dogs, and won by a man who was hallucinating his way into the history books. It is a story that captures the raw, unregulated, and often bizarre spirit of early 20th century America, a time when the lines between bravery, science, and madness were hopelessly blurred.